Welcome to the Melanie Rose Killick story, 3-part podcast.
Welcome, I'm Patricia, introducing Melanie Rose Killick. We are here today to talk about life and her experiences and what is happening in the world for her. So, welcome, Mel.
Thank you, Patricia. It's really lovely to be here, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with you about this.
It's very exciting, wasn't it? We sort of got introduced between a mutual friend, Chantel Perrin,
yes,
who is a photographer of both of ours, isn't she? And
she has become a family photographer for my family.
Yeah, so Shani was telling me all about you and your letters to Seamus, and that's what we're here about as well. And I'd followed you for quite a while and reading those letters and felt like I'd known you forever. And Shani had showed me the beautiful photos that she'd taken, and I felt like I needed to meet you. And then there you were in our store, in my shop.
Lounge suite.
You
and some fridges.
And fridges and doing all those things. And it was like you just walked past and I felt I'd known you. And I said to another staff member, "Who was that?" And then she told me, and she didn't know your name, but I knew I'd known you. And and I went and sussed out, and I thought maybe that's got to be Melanie. It's got to be Mel. And it was. And there you were, and you came back in to fix up your purchases, and we got talking about podcasting, and I wanted to chat to you and get you to tell everybody your story. That's so important, and to have the conversation with you, and something that we can keep forever, and to let people know the journey that you've been on, and go from there.
Yes.
So do you want to start with talking about Dear Seamus, your blog and your letters?
Yes, I started this blog on Mother's Day in 2013. I decided that I was going to write letters to my son, Seamus, who had been born in November 2012. Because I had received a very dire advanced cancer prognosis at the time of his birth, I was obviously concerned that, having just had this baby, that he would grow up not knowing who I was. So the initial drive behind me doing the letters was so that he would be able to know me in the future if I happened to die of cancer while he was young. So I began these letters on Mother's Day 2013, and they became so much bigger than I imagined they would. Initially, obviously, I was writing them to Seamus, and it was an intimate exchange to him as my child. But I wanted to put them up on a blog just on the off chance that other people might enjoy reading them. And in the process of doing that, they have totally transformed me, and I have ended up coming at those letters now from a completely different angle, because not only am I still alive over 2 years later, but I feel like I'm going to be alive for a long time to come. So I can't write those letters now to Seamus with that mindset that I'm not going to be here anymore. It's morphing into something really different. And that's the beauty of doing anything creative, is you might start off with an intention and it just becomes something else. And so that's the premise of how I started the blog.
So you had walked the cancer journey before having Seamus, hadn't you?
Absolutely. I was initially diagnosed in 2008 with inflammatory breast cancer. And that was an incredible gift in my life. Up until the age of 35, I had lived my life in a certain way and with a certain perspective of the world. And for the most part, I was extremely unhappy and very disconnected. So when I got this life-threatening illness, the great gift of that, well, the greatest gift, because it's given me so much, is that it's stripped back all of these layers that I had been living with. So all of these belief systems, all of these perspectives of the world, all of these ideas about myself. And underneath, I found who I really was. And I remembered that and I reconnected with that. And that was one of the greatest gift of cancer. And then there was just so many ripple effects that came off that. Relationships changed. People went out of my life. Different people came into my life. Relationships that I had with family members changed. They became so much more loving, so much more open. I felt like I had become a spiritual student. And so I spent the next couple of years reading a lot of spiritual texts and unlearning all of the things that I had built up and learned over those 35 years of my life. So I really felt like I was reborn through the experience of having cancer. So it was really like the phoenix rising from the ashes.
So is there any past cancer in the family, or this just completely came out of nowhere?
Well, it came out of nowhere for me, but because I was adopted, they wanted to investigate my genetic history. So we did genetic testing, and that's when I became aware that I had a genetic fault known as the BRCA2 genetic fault, which gives people a higher chance of developing breast and ovarian cancer.
So have you ever found your real parents? Was there a need to, did you feel like you wanted to know them?
On and off through the years, yes, but I also felt that the great gift that my birth mother gave me was she gave birth to me.
Yep.
And perhaps that was the only relationship I was meant to have with her.
Mm.
And even though I grew up with a sense of rejection that always lived in the back of my mind, and I actually did some reading into emotional memories as opposed to cognitive memories. And it was extremely interesting because they did studies on adopted children, and they found that even though many adopted children are placed in loving homes, sometimes within days, sometimes within weeks of being born, it leaves an emotional or an energetic imprint on them. So they might grow up in a very loving home and feeling very much like they're part of that and that they were wanted and needed, but somewhere on some level, some emotional level, they feel that level of rejection, which to me, I referenced energy before, and that's what I think it's about, because we are, at the end of the day, we are energetic, vibrational beings. That's how I've come to experience life and experience other people.
So this whole cancer thing was just all new. It was a new road and everything.
Yes, and it was an incredible teacher to me. And what I've been doing lately is actually questioning whether I still need that teacher in my life. And so I've been working using my thoughts in dropping the idea that I need cancer in my life anymore. Because often, a lot of what we experience in life has to do with our belief systems. So there's beliefs around cancer, there's beliefs around illnesses in general. For example, if you get a secondary cancer diagnosis, which is like I had. So initial diagnosis in 2008, and then I had a secondary diagnosis in 2012 when I gave birth to Seamus. And the medical professionals will say to you, this now is a secondary diagnosis. So there is no cure, and we can only manage the illness, we can manage the side effects for you. So that's a belief. And it's their belief because that's what they study as medical professionals, and it's also what is in the majority of the facts or the statistics. But that's where I want to take it back a level in my own experience and say, well, what's a belief? A belief is a thought that you have over and over again. So maybe if I just change the thoughts that I'm thinking, I can have a different outcome. So I started to read lots of stories about people who had radical remissions, unexplained spontaneous healings from cancer. And something like that only has to happen once for people to understand that it's a possibility. So that's happened many times. And there's plenty of cases where people have had an experience of a terminal illness and they have recovered. And that can't be explained if you're coming from the angle of medical science.
So you had treatment the first time in 2008?
Yes.
Which reduced it and everything, didn't it?
The treatment I had in 2008 was 4 rounds of chemotherapy, a radical mastectomy of the left breast, and 6 weeks of radiation. I then had 2 years of hormone treatment. And I was classed as being in remission, which just means that there's no active cancer in the body. So because I'd had all of that treatment, I was actually advised that I would be infertile. So that was very upsetting because I was single. I didn't have a family. But what I couldn't put aside was the belief that I had and the knowing inside me that I would always have this little boy.
You dreamed him, many dreams, didn't you?
I knew that he was coming. I always knew it. I spoke about him openly with my friends.
Sebastian.
And his name at that stage was Sebastian.
Which
exactly.
we love.
Yeah. So, again, I was told I was infertile. So do I make that my belief? I chose not to.
Yep.
I chose to believe something different. So my thoughts were, in my heart, I know this little boy is coming. And there is no rhyme or reason or factual evidence to tell me how it's going to happen. I just have to believe that it's going to happen.
So you just dreamt him in the middle of the night?
Well, I referenced that in my blog by saying I dreamed him into life. Yeah, wow. So I used my imagination and I dreamed him into life. And that's exactly what's happening right here. We met each other. You, in the course of our conversation, imagined us doing a podcast together, so you suggested it. And now that is made manifest and we're sitting here now doing a podcast.
It is beautiful.
That is the strength of the imagination.
It is, isn't it?
So Seamus was conceived when I was 39 years old, and naturally. Total surprise on one level, but on the other level, an absolute confirmation of what I had always known.
So how did you meet Seamus's dad? Like, you're in Sydney, and wow.
I was living in Sydney. I had been there for 6 years. Prior to that, I had travelled all over the world, and I had lived in different states in Australia, and I was working at lots of different jobs and was just feeling, again, like I mentioned before, was feeling very disconnected, and I just felt like I couldn't really settle. So I decided I'd had enough of Sydney because it was really grinding me down. So I chose to go to Wollongong, which is where I had actually grown up. I'd done all my secondary schooling there. So there was familiarity there, and I had some friends there. But just prior to that, I had actually had a real crisis point in terms of feeling like an absolute failure in my life. So what I did was I made a list in my mind of the things that I believed that I should have accomplished by the time I was 35. And I could not tick any boxes. So I was buying into that whole idea of failure and success, which doesn't exist because it's just a concept of the mind. But at that time, I was still buying into that. And because I couldn't tick the boxes, I was single, so I was a failure at relationships. I didn't have children. You know, I was never going to be a mother. I didn't have a career. I had no real creative outlet. I was this frustrated artist that just kept hitting brick wall after brick wall. And I, for the first time in my life, in my adult life, after having grown up as a Catholic and never really experiencing God, I had a conversation, my first real conversation with God. And I didn't really even know what God was, because I knew God conceptually, but I hadn't experienced God. Yep. And I just said, hey, listen, big guy, I can't get this right by myself, so can you please help me? And I'm getting out of the driver's seat, and you can get in and drive for a while because I have buggered it up right
And don't
early.
we love that?
Yeah.
Sometimes just hand it over and say, look, just drive me because I can't do it.
And it was an absolute moment of surrender.
Yeah.
So in the next couple of days, I had the inspiration to move to Wollongong and kind of, pare back my life, pare back the stress. So I moved to Wollongong. I got a new job. I found a lovely place to live, and I got diagnosed with cancer all within 3 months. So I asked for help, and I got it. At the time, it didn't really feel like it was helping me.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. Why did I bother asking?
Keep going.
And the interesting thing is that I was having a conversation with a very dear friend of mine who came to stay 2 days ago. And she talked about, and I just loved this idea, and it really put things in perspective for me. She talked about sometimes the problem is the solution. So I surrendered, and I wanted a different way of experiencing my life. And I ended up with a cancer diagnosis, which I thought was a big problem.
Yeah, wow.
As most people would.
Yeah, hello.
But the cancer diagnosis was the solution to the way that I had been living my life. And it allowed me to strip everything back, to get back to who I really was, and to experience for the first time this thing that we call God. And I'm kind of even loath to use the word God, because as soon as you say certain words, it comes with a whole bunch of baggage. So there's all these concepts and ideas about what God is, depending on your religious background, what your parents told you, who your peers are, what culture you live in. But for the sake of having an understanding in this conversation, then it's easy to just use that word, God.
It is.
I don't think of God as a person. I think of God as an experience.
And you say that through your letters, don't you? That
Yes.
comes quite clear in those, in dearshamus.com.
Yeah, and I've been really fine-tuning that even more lately. And it's because the more I learn, the more I read, the more I open myself to these different concepts about the idea that we are all one. So we're all connected, even though we are experiencing each other as separate entities. And I heard a really beautiful analogy the other day using your hand. So if you look at your hand and you focus on the fingers, you see different sizes, different shapes. One has a different looking nail, one might have a callus on it or a scar. They're all very different looking. However, they're all joined to the hand. They're all part of the hand. So that is how I am experiencing life and how I'm experiencing other people.
It's a beautiful way to look at it.
Oh, look, I loved that analogy when
wow.
when I heard it, and yeah, it was a really inspired way of looking at it. And I think when you understand that connectedness, you go about your day in a very different way. You'll treat people differently, and you'll think about yourself very differently as well. And the core message of my letters to Seamus is about self-love and being the authentic experience of who you are. So in my experience of life, I had all of these layers built up one on top of the other, all of these belief systems, and holding on to experiences. Oh, well, if I do that, it equals this. So that, that forms belief systems in us. And so, I stripped all of that back. I rediscovered myself, and there was this incredible love there that I hadn't experienced before, and it completely changed my life.
So here you are in Wollongong. How do we get to Geelong?
Good question.
Because we're like worlds apart, really, aren't we?
Yes. So thank you for helping me get back on with the original question.
It's all good.
So we're in Wollongong. I've been through all this cancer treatment. I'm working for a community health organisation, and they're very, very good to me. They give me all these extra sick days. They encourage me to come into work even though I feel awful from all the treatment, and they say, Mel, sit behind the desk and smile at people as they walk in the door. That's all you have to do.
Oh, I want your job.
Just be there and answer the phone when it rings. And so it was very, very important to be in this really loving environment.
Yeah.
I ended up with chronic fatigue, which is very common when you go through that kind of cancer treatment.
Right, yeah.
So I couldn't hold down my job anymore. It became very expensive for me to maintain the flat that I was living in by myself. So it kind of felt a little bit like I was backed into a corner in terms of making a decision. My mother had moved to Geelong, I think about 8 years prior, and she said, come home. And it was never home to me, because she'd kind of...
Well, she'd
moved there, yeah. I had never lived there, but of course, where my mum was always going to be home.
Well,
so she
home
said,
is where your heart is.
Yes. So she said, come home. So I came home to Geelong, this tiny little village in the middle of rural New South Wales with 150 residents, and I thought, my life is over.
Oh, don't be so harsh.
I thought, I could just see myself then living out the rest of my days with my mum and my cat.
Yeah.
And
on the rocking chair on the veranda.
Yes, and I kind of thought, well, okay, if that's going to be my life, well,
so be it.
So be it. And so I really committed myself to being the spiritual student and reading a lot of different texts.
And that's a huge move from Wollongong to Geelong. You're talking beach to dirt.
Yes.
Really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And that really dry heat. And yeah, so I remember, sitting on the lounge and, with sweating away in front of a fan reading my Eckhart Tolle books and my Osho texts. And yes, and I was aware of a few of the people that lived in the community, and one of them was John, and he was in a relationship with someone when I first moved to town, and I just kind of knew him to say hello to, really.
As we all do. Passes in the street.
That's right. And in those small communities,
Yeah.
you know, even if you don't know someone,
Yeah.
you'll still give them a
You
wave,
still
which is
wave. Yeah.
that's a really beautiful part of living in a small community.
is.
You'll acknowledge people.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're doing is you're saying, I see you.
Yeah.
Whereas in the city, that gets lost.
Yeah.
People don't want to see you anymore because they're too tied up in what's going on in their head. So I, became aware that his, relationship finished, and it was about a year after that, I think. This situation arose where we could spend some time together, and I was just about to move to Queensland because I had, recovered sufficiently to the point where I felt like I wanted to take a next step with my life. And so I wanted to study nutrition. And so I booked myself into this college up in Brisbane, and John and I spent some time together, and it was a case of saying, well, I'm going to do this road trip to Brisbane. Do you want to come? Yeah, sure. Very spur of the moment. So he came on this road trip with me, and we had a little bit of an adventure together, driving up through New South Wales and into Queensland, and he stayed on with me a few days, and then he left to come back, and I was very busy with getting organised for the semester to start, and I was studying 4 university level subjects, so I really wanted to concentrate on getting my act together because I hadn't studied for a long time. And we felt like there was a connection between us that was quite lovely, and so we decided to keep in touch and just see how things might unfold. And a couple of weeks later, I discovered that I was pregnant.
Wow.
So that's how things unfolded.
That's very quick. So,
And that
I'll
was-
tie it back to Gaylong.
So, yeah, well, I stayed. I decided that seeing as I not only, I didn't just have one brain anymore, I had 2. So I thought, well, I'm going to take on an extra 2 subjects.
Oh,
So I had all-day morning sickness in which I ate copious amounts of watermelon and cheesels and drank gallons of orange juice and studied. I went to my classes and I came home and I studied, and occasionally I threw up in between, and that's pretty much all I did.
awesome.
So I stayed for 1 semester and absolutely blitzed all of the exams. I still don't really know how I did that. Again, I'm attributing it to the fact that there was 2 brains going on. Seamus's growing brain and mine. And then I left and came back to Gaylong, and John and I decided that we would see how things, again, let's see how things unfold. So there was no pressure, there was no obligation. There was plenty of conversations where we decided that we would certainly give the relationship a go, but if the relationship didn't work, that we would then be totally committed to being the best parents possible, and that we would leave out any spitefulness or any negativity that perhaps might come with the breakdown of a relationship, because the focus was always going to be on this child that we had created together. So I think because we removed all of the pressure, because love requires freedom, love requires air to breathe. And we did that, so it fanned the flame and it became a real, genuine love, which was built on the foundations of friendship.
This has been another LMB studio production.